Welcome to Life Stories, where real experiences come to life. Today's story is about love, loss, and the unexpected betrayals that can come from within our own families. Jessica thought she had built a peaceful home with her husband and mother-in-law, but everything changed when greed and entitlement knocked on her door. As tragedy struck, she found herself facing not only heartbreak but also a ruthless fight for what was rightfully hers. How did she overcome it all? Stay with us to find out. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. Let's dive into the story. My name is Jessica, and until recently, I lived a quiet, contented life. At 35, I had found happiness in a simple but fulfilling routine, sharing a home with my husband, Daniel, and his mother, Margaret. We weren't a grand, extraordinary family, but we had something special, a home filled with warmth, kindness, and respect. When I married Daniel, I hadn't given much thought to living arrangements. I had my career, and I was determined to continue working after marriage. But Daniel had always been concerned about his mother. His father had passed away when he was just starting middle school, and from that moment on, Margaret had taken on everything, raising 2 children alone, keeping a roof over their heads, and making sure they never felt the weight of the sacrifices she made. It wasn't long after our wedding that I proposed the idea. Margaret, what do you think about living with us? If you're okay with it, I'll be out during the day for work, so you'll still have plenty of quiet time like you're used to. And besides, food always tastes better when you share it. Don't you think? Margaret smiled, her eyes softening. To be honest, living alone has been a bit lonely lately, she admitted. A rare confession from such a strong woman. And just like that, we made the decision to share a home. Daniel, who had always worried about his mother, was relieved. He had kept his concerns bottled up, not wanting to pressure her. But the truth was, he wanted her close. We knew neither our current apartments nor Margaret's small house would be suitable for the 3 of us. So we made a bold decision. We pooled our resources, bought a new house, and built a home together. The transition was surprisingly smooth. We arranged Margaret's room on the ground floor since her legs were weaker than they used to be, and Daniel and I took the 2nd floor. I had expected some adjustment, but living with her turned out to be easier than I had ever imagined. Margaret wasn't overbearing or intrusive. She was generous with her kindness and respectful of our space. She even taught me how to cook, something I had never quite mastered. Jessica, thank you so much for cooking for us every day. But don't push yourself too hard, I told her one evening as we set the table together. We're going to be living like this for a long time. If you burn yourself out now, it'll be tough down the line. She shook her head, smiling. What are you saying? I'm living with you, so let me at least do this. If I don't contribute, I'll feel like I'm freeloading, and I can't stand that. Our home was filled with these little moments, light-hearted exchanges that made life richer. Daniel, who had been nervous about the usual mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflicts, soon relaxed. Seeing us get along so well allowed him to fully focus on his work without worrying about the dynamics at home. Jessica, thank you for getting along so well with my mom, he told me one evening, pulling me into a warm embrace. I'll work even harder to make you happy. I laughed, pressing my forehead against his. Daniel, I already have everything I need. You and Margaret are my happiness. If I ask for more, I might jinx it. And truly, I wished those peaceful days would never end. But life, as it often does, had other plans. About 6 months after we started living together, I noticed a change in Margaret. She was quieter, distracted, and sometimes seemed troubled. At first, I thought it might just be fatigue. But as the days passed, the unease in her expression became harder to ignore. Is something bothering you, Margaret? I asked gently one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. If you have any worries, I'm here. She hesitated at first, but after a moment, She let out a quiet sigh. Lisa and Mark have been stopping by almost every day, she finally admitted. They said they were short on cash, so they took money from my purse. And they've been raiding the fridge, too. They're treating this house like their own. I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. Lisa, Daniel's sister, wasn't someone I knew well. I had met her briefly before the wedding. And again on our big day. I still remembered how she had looked me up and down, as if she were assessing something of little value. So this is Daniel's type, she had muttered to someone nearby. I never would have guessed. She's so plain. Just fades into the background. If I were a guy, I wouldn't give her a second glance. It had stung. But I had brushed it off at the time. Daniel had mentioned that Lisa had always been a bit wild. But I hadn't imagined it would be like this. Despite being over 40, she didn't have a steady job. She and her husband, Mark, seemed to drift from one situation to the next. Always scraping by. Always looking for an easy way out. Margaret's voice pulled me back. She's been like this for years, she admitted. Even when I scolded her in the past. She never listened. And if you're thinking it's because of how I raised her, you're right. It's all my fault. No, Margaret. I reassured her, reaching for her hand. This isn't your fault. Adults make their own choices. Lisa and Mark are responsible for their own actions. Daniel, who had overheard our conversation, ran a hand through his hair, sighing deeply. So my sister is still causing trouble, he muttered. I thought she'd mellow out after getting married. But it seems to have done the exact opposite. It was the first time I saw true exhaustion in his expression. Margaret bit her lip, her worry growing. In 3 days. It's payday. They'll surely come knocking again. I really wish we could stop them this time. Daniel thought about taking a day off to confront them. But his workload made it impossible. I'll stay home instead, I offered. Better than leaving Margaret to deal with them alone. If they start demanding money, I'll step in. And so, we braced ourselves for what was to come. But nothing could have prepared me for how far Lisa and Mark were willing to go. The morning of payday arrived with a strange sense of inevitability. I woke up early. Not because I had to, but because I couldn't shake the tension that had settled into my bones. Margaret was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. Her hands slow as she prepared breakfast. Are you sure about this, Jessica? She asked. Worry clear in her voice. I nodded. They can't keep treating you like this, Margaret. Someone has to put a stop to it. She sighed, looking down at the teapot as steam curled from its spout. Lisa has always been like this, taking, demanding. She thinks the world owes her something. And Mark, he enables it. I could hear the guilt in her voice. No mother wants to believe that she raised a selfish, inconsiderate child. But Margaret wasn't blind to reality. As we sat down for breakfast, I kept glancing at the clock. I knew it was only a matter of time before they showed up. Bold as ever. And sure enough, just before noon, the front door swung open without so much as a knock. Hey, Mom, we're home. Lisa's voice rang through the house like an unwelcome alarm. I turned to Margaret, seeing her flinch slightly at her daughter's words. We're home. As if they belonged here. Lisa strolled in with all the entitlement of someone who had paid for the roof over her head. Behind her, Mark followed, looking around the kitchen with an expression that could only be described as lazy expectation. We're famished, Lisa declared, dropping herself into a chair. Got anything good? Anything will do. Just rustle up some lunch. Okay. Margaret hesitated. But before she could say anything, Lisa's eyes landed on me. Her expression immediately darkened. Wait. Why is Jessica here? She demanded. As if I were the intruder. Aren't you supposed to be at work? I took the day off to spend time with Margaret. I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Lisa scoffed. Spend time with Mom? Right. She leaned back, folding her arms. Anyway, we'll have whatever's ready. Oh. And Mark's in the mood for something hot. So make sure it's fresh. Something inside me snapped. I stood up, placing both hands on the table as I stared her down. Wait a minute, I said, my voice firm. You just walked in here and said we're home. Don't you think that's a little strange? Lisa frowned. What are you talking about? I gestured around us. This isn't your house. Lisa. You don't live here. You barge in. Help yourself to our food. Take money from Margaret's purse. And act like it's normal. It's not normal. And honestly, it's not okay. For a brief moment, Lisa was silent. Then she laughed, sharp. Dismissive. Wow. Look at you. Acting all high and mighty, she sneered. Remember your place. Jessica. You're only here because of my brother. How dare you talk to me like that? Mark, who had been quiet up until now, chimed in. Yeah. If you've got time to argue, you've got time to start cooking. I felt my hands clench into fists. Margaret looked completely dejected. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes fixed on the table. Lisa, however, had no shame. She stood up, made her way to the fridge, and began pulling things out as if it belonged to her. A carton of eggs, a package of bacon, even a loaf of bread. She piled them into a grocery bag without hesitation. You know what, she said, turning back to us with a smirk. I'll just take this instead. Saves you the trouble of cooking. You should be grateful I'm not asking for more. My heart pounded with frustration, but I forced myself to stay calm. Familiarity shouldn't be an excuse for disrespect. And Lisa and Mark, they didn't just cross the line, they stomped all over it. At least, with me present. They hadn't started demanding money. That was the only small victory I could take from today. But when Daniel got home that evening and I told him everything, his reaction was different from before. He wasn't just frustrated. He was angry. I'll set them straight, he said. His voice low. Steady. I won't let them run rampant anymore. I've reached my limit. Margaret, guilt-ridden, kept apologizing. I'm sorry for all the trouble. But I shook my head. This isn't your fault, Margaret. We sat together, discussing what had to be done. The next time Lisa and Mark came knocking, they wouldn't find an open door. And finally, for the first time in a long time, Margaret allowed herself to hope. The morning after our confrontation with Lisa and Mark, the atmosphere in the house was heavy. Margaret moved slowly, her usual warmth dulled by guilt and exhaustion. Daniel, on the other hand, was seething. I had never seen him this angry before, not at work. Not in arguments. Not even in moments of deep frustration. They've pushed too far this time, he said as he paced the living room. His jaw clenched. I was willing to ignore their nonsense before. But this is different. I watched him, understanding exactly what he meant. There was something especially cruel about how Lisa and Mark had treated Margaret. The very person who had sacrificed everything for them. And yet, they showed no gratitude. No respect, just entitlement. Margaret let out a weary sigh, placing a hand on Daniel's arm. I don't want this to turn into a fight, son. Daniel turned to her, his expression softening only slightly. Mom, they are fighting. They just don't use fists, they use guilt, manipulation, and entitlement. He exhaled sharply. I can't let them keep walking all over you. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. I knew she hated conflict, but she also understood that this couldn't go on. We spent that evening discussing how to handle the situation. Daniel wanted to confront Lisa and Mark directly, but his workload made it impossible to take time off. I'll handle it, I offered, my voice steady. I'll stay home, and I won't let them get away with anything. Daniel looked at me, concern flickering in his eyes. Are you sure? I nodded. Someone has to do it. Margaret shouldn't have to deal with them alone. The plan was simple. If Lisa and Mark showed up again, they wouldn't be welcomed. There would be no food, no money, and no tolerance for their behavior. The next day, I woke up early, bracing myself for what was to come. Margaret was quiet over breakfast, and I could tell she was dreading the inevitable. And sure enough, just before noon, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath before opening the door. Lisa stood there with Mark behind her, his hands stuffed into his pockets, both of them wearing expressions of casual arrogance. "Hey, Mom," Lisa said with a fake cheerfulness, stepping forward as if she already owned the place. "We figured we'd drop by for lunch. What's cooking?" I didn't step aside. I stood firm in the doorway, meeting her gaze with unwavering resolve. "You're not coming in." Lisa blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You can't just barge in here whenever you feel like it. This isn't your home." "Lisa." Her face darkened, and I could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Oh, so now you're making the rules?" She let out a sharp laugh. "You're really getting ahead of yourself." "Jessica." Mark sighed, already annoyed. "Look, let's not make this a thing. We're hungry. Just let us in." I crossed my arms. "No. If you're hungry, you can buy your own food. If you need money, you can work for it. But you cannot keep showing up here and expecting Margaret to provide for you." Lisa's face twisted in irritation. "You've really got some nerve." She turned to Margaret, her tone instantly shifting to something more saccharine. "Mom, are you really going to let her talk to me like this?" Margaret hesitated, her hands tightening around the fabric of her dress. I could see the years of guilt weighing on her shoulders. The struggle between standing up for herself and the ingrained instinct to care for her children no matter what. But then, for the first time, she straightened her back and looked Lisa in the eye. "Jessica is right," she said quietly. "You can't keep treating this house like your own personal bank and restaurant." Lisa's jaw dropped. "Mom, you don't mean that." Margaret's voice wavered, but she held her ground. "I do." Mark, sensing that things weren't going their way, muttered under his breath and turned to Lisa. "Let's go. This is a waste of time." Lisa glared at me as if she wanted to burn a hole through my skull. "You're going to regret this." "Jessica." I didn't flinch. "No. Lisa. You will." With a final huff, she spun on her heel and stormed off, Mark following behind her. I closed the door and turned back to Margaret, who let out a shaky breath. "That was difficult," she admitted. "But necessary," I said. She nodded slowly, a mix of relief and sadness in her eyes. "I just hope this is really the end of it." I wanted to believe that too, but something told me Lisa and Mark weren't done yet. In the end, Lisa and Mark got exactly what they deserved. After being thrown out of the house, they found themselves without a roof over their heads, with no money and no real jobs. They were forced to take whatever work they could find, scraping by with temporary day jobs. For a while, they even slept in a park, unable to afford rent. The same arrogance that once fueled them had now left them abandoned, with no one willing to help. Margaret and I, on the other hand, found peace, without the constant manipulation and toxic presence of Lisa and Mark. Our home became warm and safe again. Of course, Daniel's absence was still painful. We missed him every single day, but we carried his memory in our hearts, honoring him by continuing the life he would have wanted for us. Over time, Margaret regained her spirit. She smiled more, cooked meals that filled our home with comfort, and even encouraged me to return to work. I knew that no matter what, we would always have each other. Lisa tried reaching out once or twice, but Margaret had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let her daughter drag her down any longer. "I've spent my life taking care of her," she told me one day. "Now, I just want to live in peace." And that's exactly what we did. Sometimes, family isn't about blood, it's about love, respect, and the people who truly stand by you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more real-life experiences like this one. See you in the next video.